Hello, and welcome to this Robin Hood moment. We've taken a lot of calculated risks and made several successful smart bets on new or emerging poverty solutions, but perhaps none as bold as the one we took on creating and launching the Mobility Labs program, a 4-year, $25 million bet on a pioneering approach that centers community voice and trust in the development of new, homegrown solutions to poverty. My name is Kevin Thompson, and I'm the Managing Director of Communications at Robin Hood, and today we are pleased to spend this Robin Hood moment with Lori Boozer, the Managing Director of Robin Hood's Mobility Labs program. Lori, welcome, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Kevin.
Lori, so excited to have you. Tell us a little bit about Mobility Labs. When was it launched and who are your partners?
Great. So Mobility Labs stands for Mobility Learning and Action Bets. And it was launched in 2019 because as a foundation, we realized that we needed to learn and we needed to take some risks in terms of thinking about how we were addressing the poverty conversation. And we formed a partnership with several funders and decided to embark on what we think is a pretty innovative approach to sourcing solutions from community. The funders that we work with are the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Harry and Jeanette Weinberg Foundation, the Tipping Point Community Foundation out in California, an anonymous donor, and of course, Robin Hood, who represents our New York partners.
Wow, big guns.
Big guns, fully loaded.
So, Lori, what does that word mobility in your title sort of reference? How is that related to poverty? I know people sometimes don't always understand the context for it.
The word mobility, I think, can be tricky because we do think of poverty as a static set of circumstances. But for us in the work, we're really looking at a couple of things. One, these three constructs of economic success, power and autonomy, and belonging. And how do those three constructs really impact a person or a family's ability to move from poverty into a place above that poverty, the poverty line? And then with that mobility, we think about what are the shocks and the things that keep families sort of going back and forth between poverty, out of poverty, in poverty, out of poverty. What would it actually take for an individual to stay above that line? And what does that look like? And I think what's really interesting about our approach is it's not so much rooted in what we as an organization think makes sense. It's really leading into the perspectives of the community to sort of tell us what makes sense based on their lived experience. We are not actually experiencing poverty. I'm not experiencing poverty. So we need to rely on those who are in the day-to-day moment to say, here's what's best, here's what we think would work. And then how do we build trust with community to be able to support those ideas to come to life?
Let's explore those three things: economic success, power and autonomy, and belonging. How are you all defining economic success? Is there one definition for that, or does it sort of vary with the communities that you are working within?
I think if we were to look at it from a traditional perspective, we would say economic success is really just the measure of how much it takes for a person, perhaps financially, to be above the poverty line. Within the work that we do, we really allow each of the communities to work specifically to their needs in identifying what does economic success mean in the context of their community, and then in the context of the life of the person or the family that their work is really focused on. So it's a real partnership in terms of figuring out how do we reach a definition that works for everyone.
Yeah, so it's not really about adhering to an economic dollar standard as much as it is what the community defines as their level of economic success.
Exactly. And within that, obviously people want jobs, people want to work,
Right.
They want sustainable sources of income. But it's really about freeing up space for the community to define more specifically what that looks like for them. What types of jobs? Why are certain industries more important in certain communities? So if you look at some of the work happening in different communities, you'll see, for example, in a community like Brownsville, there's a real focus on entrepreneurship and ownership of the community, which is rooted in the historical context of disinvestment in that community. So how do we find new pathways for people to access forms of employment?
That's almost, I don't want to call it new because it isn't new today. But when you first started this work, it was relatively new, and it almost seemed incongruous with, traditional prescriptive approaches to philanthropy and grant making in a way, because you're really centering the solution part of it with the community that's living the experience.
Exactly. And what's incongruous is not so much that anything that we do is wrong. It's that we may not have always made the space necessary to fully hear from community, and then to take that a step further and say, well, what does it look like to actually give the dollars towards your recommendations, not necessarily just what the data might tell us as an organization or what evidence-based solutions might look like, but are there other things that are not captured in that because we're so wedded to one approach that perhaps the community brings to light for us? And so there's really just been this give and take with us building trust with the community and saying, we will fund your ideas and work with you to try to bring these ideas to life.
Is this where the notion of power and autonomy come in? How does that look in the work that you're doing?
Exactly. Power and autonomy, or if you think about who traditionally holds power, right? Money, obviously, when you have access to dollars, you inherently hold power in determining how those dollars are used, where those dollars go. And so when we think about power and autonomy, I think that that's definitely one aspect of it. And then within that, there's also the sort of empowering community to feel the ownership or the ability to lead the process for themselves in a real way. And I think it's important to point out that oftentimes what we're looking at as funders is the sort of direct service approach to the work. We want to fund an organization to provide a service to a group of people that we believe will help said group achieve economic sustainability out of poverty. With this approach, I think what we're looking at is it could be that, but it could also be that the community as a whole has a need to develop an infrastructure that will really shift the space of that community to thrive in a very different way. That isn't just about the individual. And I think that we learned that in the process. We didn't start out thinking that that's where we would go. I think we thought, oh, we'll fund some services and it'll be what it is, but that the community will just tell us different sets of services that they needed. I think what we got was, well, no, we actually don't want to fight about funding. We want to form coalitions. We want to work together with groups with different organizations. We want to actually build something that can catch resources and to be able to have real power in dictating and directing how that money is used. I think a good example would be the recent endeavor with the Brooklyn Borough President and Brownsville, right? And so we see the catalytic impact of a mobility labs being that we seeded this thing, but because of what they've built in terms of the relationships that they formed with different organizations, they have a capacity to now catch what the borough president wants to do, not as just a recipient, but as a driver of the conversation and being able to direct him in terms of here's what the community really wants and how do we have a real partnership. I think what we see historically is so much of people coming in and just saying, okay, we'll give you money for this or we'll give you money for that. And you feel like you have to just take it because there's such a dire need. And there's a very different thing than saying, how do we figure out collectively what you'd like to do? And how do we support that? And then how do we give you some ownership and power in that process?
And that at its essence probably best describes what the funding from your program is used for with these to facilitate all of that.
Exactly. And the beauty of this is that we really did allow it to morph and take shape in the feedback that we've gotten from our community partners just wasn't there before. You would hear from places like Brownsville that people didn't want to invest, right? And so there's a very different thing when you feel like, oh, like Robin Hood is there, like there's interest here, and they're trusting this community to do this work. What else can we do? Who else can come to the table?
So we've talked about economic success. We've talked about the principles of power and autonomy. What about belonging? How does that show up in this program?
It's really just revisiting the truth that has always been there, which is that community is deeply invested in its own success. And there's something very different about, and this is true for us as individuals, when a person is given sort of the ownership over their own choices and destinies, a very different personal investment than when someone is telling you what to do. And I think we see that at the community level, just in the pride of saying that we built this, right? They gave us this money and we built something that we feel really good about, that even if Robinhood or the funder isn't there, they are committed now to
They're belonging.
Right, they're belonging, right? They found this is a place for them and they want to pursue this irrespective of who's funding it, right? It's their thing. And I think that was really important. It always reminds me of sort of just historical movements where we've always known community to be the actor in its own best interest, right? It's usually outside forces that sort of muck things up and think that they know best. And in this instance, I think it's really sort of revisiting that model of letting community be the driver.
Robinhood has always been a very New York-centric organization. Why was it important to launch this effort across the country, and what communities are you in?
And just to be clear, we have 9 communities across the country. So there are 3 here in New York City. I mentioned Brownsville. We have Flushing and Queens. We also do some work in the Bronx, 3 out on the West Coast, the Bayview, East San Jose, and a community called East Contra Costa County, which is in the East Bay area, and then 1 each in Baltimore, Northeast Pennsylvania, and Harvey, Illinois. And it's a really sort of vast expanse of what poverty looks like. There's rural, there's urban, there's suburban. And so it gives us as a foundation, and what we hope will be interesting for the sector, to really see how this type of investment with this flexibility can shape the way we tackle poverty in those different spaces, in a rural versus an urban versus a suburban. What are we learning? What's similar in those dynamics? Was very different. If you look at a community like NEPA, Northeast Pennsylvania, very large rural space, not the same context as a urban, densely populated environment like a Flushing or a Brownsville, right? And so there's some similarities in the issues that they face, but their approach to solving the problem might be different. And that's where really letting community decide becomes important. Had we gone in and said, everyone needs to do X, it might not have worked because these are some very different communities.
Right. So the issues might be the same, but the post-scriptive sort of approach that every community is taking might lead them to different solutions.
Right.
Lori, this is a 4-year program, and you're just in the middle of year 3 here, and you've gotten over 3-year planning process. What have we learned here, and how has the Mobility Lab's approach influenced the work of Robinhood?
A couple of things. In terms of what we've learned and what both the sector and Robinhood may take away from this, I think it's a couple of things. One, it's needing to rethink metrics and think about them in a way that incorporates the community voice as a part of that process. We do have a learning and evaluation partner that we work with, and so we do try to find new ways to think about how we give Robinhood what it needs, and also how do we honor the voice of community in thinking about the learning and evaluation process. So how do we really reflect community in every aspect of the work, not just in the pilot project itself? And the second thing is the power and importance of building infrastructure in community. So much of the work is about zip code not being destiny, which translates into how do we cream the crop and create exit strategies for people to leave a zip code, because it is going to be destiny, as opposed to how do we make the zip code better. I think the last thing I'll say is the power of collaboration between organizations, and really the scarcity mentality that can exist in the sector where organizations have to compete against each other for dollars. I think very telling in the Flushing scenario was when the CEO of one of our main partners called and was like, look, we don't want to fight over the money. This is an awesome opportunity. Would you be willing to let us work together? And we said yes. The reality is that the resources are not varied in community, and they can work together, and they should. So I think that those are the major takeaways. And then I got to add one more thing, which is that the ownership piece for community. We, as humans, I think we lose sight of how important it is to be in charge of our own destinies. And we think that because a person is experiencing poverty, that they don't have the same desire. And it's just not true. It should just be, we have the dollars, you have the thoughts and the ideas or the vision or the dream. And how do we just
this is where the
together? Right.
Right. And this is where the trust comes in.
And this is where the trust comes in.
Yeah.
There's a whole other story about why we don't.
And we're going to talk about that another day. I am so glad that you were able to join us today, because that's all the time we have. Lori, you've got an interesting legacy that you're going to be leaving Robin Hood with. This program is going to teach us a lot of lessons. We're really excited about it. I'm Kevin Thompson. Thanks for listening today, and do join us again. To learn more information about Robin Hood news, interviews, or stories of our impact, visit us at robinhood.org.